Well, thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be with you. So I think as a brief introduction, I am a advisor to pensions and asset managers, mostly outside of the US, but some here in the US. And what I do essentially is I work with portfolio construction questions and solve for the decorrelation and the sourcing of real, what I refer to as causal tail risks, rather than the Excel exercise of linear regression. So I do that. I help people find managers and build portfolios. And that's, I think, the brief version. I've done it for in various parts of the market for the past 20 plus so years. We initially, I think, got in touch through Water Asset Management, which is a manager who I've invested in on part of clients. And yeah, I think that's sort of the introduction I had in mind.
That's right. We met in Short Hills, my hometown, where you came out, train from the city, and spent the evening with us. So it's nice. And one last thing on your background, your alumni degrees.
Right. So yeah, I mean, in terms of alumni, I think the broader version of that is, from an academic standpoint, I am from Sweden, so that's my accent. Stockholm University, where I spent time and lived subject matters such as purchasing power parity analytics and others. I'm not a big organizational person, to be frank. I enjoy sort of the affiliation with 361, but generally speaking, I stay out of, partially because I've spent my life as a allocator. I stay out of these organizations because 361 brings a network that's interesting, but generally speaking, it, as you know, with many of these interactions, it creates a tremendous amount of noise. So you have to be a bit selective.
And then let's look back on 2020. Tell us about 2020 for you.
Yeah, so I mean, 2020, I think one of the more, I guess that's for edit, right? I think one of the more noteworthy reflections I remember during 2020 was conversations with boards and trustees that were referring to, how to be prepared and ready and how to act in the event of an upcoming crisis. And what stands out to me is that was a common line of reasoning across the board. I think for many of us, when you hear, how do we solve for the next one like this? How do we prepare? And I think the crucial reflection that I've taken with me is most advisors, most managers, whether you're a captive CIO for an endowment or if you are in the sort of commercial side of the business, we need to spend more time with our board and our trustees. We can't come together when things explode, right? So the obvious, and this is no news to anyone in this forum, but we need to recognize that the planning we do for stressed periods is done way in advance in our strategic asset allocation. And whatever actions we take in the midst of a crisis should be highly marginal, if any. So I think the tendency is we're fairly action-oriented in this country. We just want to act, but that action is going to happen not in the midst of the crisis. I think in 2020, my best investments were, well, I'm a big fan of whenever you can make allocation decisions based on the risks. Most of what we live today is trying to create a more predictable portfolio. And if you want to create a predictable portfolio, you really need to turn to, in my mind, alternatives. And the reason for it is otherwise you're a taker of the outcome of the global macro. And I think we've proven at this point that no one is going to predict with a great accuracy the impact of a Fed decision or a policy at large, at least not repeatably and over time. So from that standpoint, I work from the standpoint of risks, and I want those risks to be so understandable that I don't need to open Excel to decide if it's a correlation of 3.47 or 3.48. Once I'm in that rabbit hole, I'm analyzing small fractional differences to no utility. So an investment on behalf of clients, I'm referring to here, in Water Asset Management's private equity business was something very intuitive, right? Because you're looking at, without going too deep into it, but water is a asset, as we know, that has, no price elasticity. Demand stays the same whether it's 1929 or 2001, and supply is constrained. Things like that, I'm able to sort of define that risk. It's a little harder to define the upside, but at least I know very clearly what type of risk I'm taking. And should it, God forbid, correlate to the S&P, I know it's not causal, and I can, I dare say, ignore it a little bit more than others. So I made another investment in a non-performing loan manager, again, on behalf of a client, whose mechanism of return generation is debt forgiveness. And if you look at debt forgiveness, it is essentially a way to use what we refer to as, on one hand, price discovery to buy rights, but you avoid the price discovery aspect when you're trying to generate your value for your investors. It's more of an, I refer to it as effort arbitrage, or I'll paraphrase, I think that's the Polar Asset Management in Canada tends to refer to it as effort arbitrage. And that's rather elegant, because any strategies that deploy our mechanic effort to generate a better profile is a little bit more reliable than price discovery or the hopes of someone else taking it off your hands at a higher price.
So 2021 predictions. Name one for us.
In one word or less.
That's the very end. Just at this point, one asset class, industry, country, do you think will rise or fall the most, and why?
Fair enough. I think that the asset classes that rise and fall the most within 12-month horizon are generally rising or falling because that the sentiment is catching up with the actual actions. So then with that horizon, we're not really talking about fundamental drivers, we're talking about sentiment. And I think we've spent enough time in private equity that now people are shifting into venture capital. And I think for some good reasons. It's perhaps more defensive to think that a tech-centric portfolio or a future-centric portfolio is a safer bet than building a portfolio around value assets that rely on the cyclical economy to a greater extent. You remember in the 90s, so the venture capital era of the time when the game was how many funds you could launch before you had to produce your performance data. We've kind of moved beyond that, and we've also moved into an economy where an exit doesn't necessarily require building your own company, treasury, operations, and admin for a future IPO. But we're really, I think, more about the venture funds, and the styles I appreciate are those that think about the manager as allocating capital to the highest value portion of the development cycle. So it's more of a project, and the more nimble and obviously easier to divest. So I think that's the prediction for venture capital. Private equity will chug along. The liquid markets has really become more of a environment for the haves and the have-nots, meaning I align myself with people that have the resources to arbitrage those shrinking alpha spreads, or as we keep redefining alpha. That's a little tougher, but there are some there as well.
And then aside from investing, what are your philanthropic interests, particularly for the coming year?
I'll tell you, that's interesting. So I've always found that there's an interesting disconnect, and I wish I did better on a personal level in terms of contributing, but I've seen a few initiatives that are common amongst the finance community. One is we appreciate the idea of education. which I think is good because it addresses the root cause of sort of societal disparities. But the issue is, if we want to help, we easily slide into this classic question of who is responsible for the upbringing of the kids. Is it the school? Is it the parents? Or is it where in that ecosystem do we sit? And I've heard about, and I've seen, I feel too many well-intended efforts to extend free math education to disenfranchised kids and so on. When I see those things, I remember my youth as a skateboarder, and frankly, tongue in cheek, there's not that many kids, whether they're upstanding kids or kids that need support, that out of their own volition will go, yay, finally free math classes on my evenings, So it's not the availability, but it's a little bit of bringing more of a guardian or a supportive role into their context. So if I had an opportunity, I'd like to support those efforts that are closely aligned with where they live. So if it is call it a little grimy skateboarding community, or the kids playing basketball on that banged up arena, but it's probably not putting up flyers for free arithmetic classes for anyone who wants. Just don't see that way working. But listen, it's easy to pass judgment and have opinions in a field that's this hard to solve.
Well, we'll talk about that offline. In terms of how we can help you, how can our network ecosystem help you?
I'd put that the other way around. It's an open invitation. I work not from the standpoint of utility, meaning I don't look to meet those people that would be my clients. I look to meet people that are engaged in the next generation of portfolio construction. So it's a question of mutual understanding. I'm always interested in talking to people that understand that linear regressions don't work, that we need to think about the needs of the capital base, not about how we relate to the broader industry. We're never going to affect that sort of change or breakout we want if we're trying to innovate within the tightly defined box of our endowment universe, or we're just trying to deviate just the right amount from our peers. That's also a challenging problem, and I respect people that don't pursue this, because there's a lot of career risks involved in pursuing that, right? But I'm generally just open to engage with people that are driven by the intellectual premise, not the career premise.
Well, you now are duly invited to our asset allocation update summit, where this is discussed. Those who are talking their books from the liquids or private equity will have different opinions than your earlier comments, but
I'm sure.
And then for 2021, or for now into 21, what's the one word that you think would capture what you'd like to associate with next year?
I think it is a unified theory of asset allocation. That's a lot of words, but if you wanted one word, I don't know. Go Giants. I have no idea. I don't speak in bullets. I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll take unified theory of asset allocation.
Yep. And what I'm driving at, that's a little glib of me to say, but essentially what I'm saying is that's the arms race of asset management we're dealing with. We're trying to incorporate more and more data into our decision making, and the unified is just implying that we're trying to capture as many aspects of the real society as possible. I think that's on the parting note there perhaps, but if you take ESG as an example, I feel strongly about it. I wrote the draft first Volvo Cars ESG policy for the pension, and we've come in such a far way from there, but staying humble is probably the way to go. I recently was schooled by a former colleague, and he raised a question which I think is worth perhaps leaving as a point of reflection for the audience, which is, would you invest, if you aspire to be ESG centric, would you invest in a solar company governed by two German guys in pinstripe suits, or would you invest in a oil and gas business governed by a progressive management with gender equality and ethnic background dispersion that is truly trying to make the oil and gas company more clean? So is it the trajectory we're investing in or the state? And I would argue that we're probably going to be more impactful as investors if we steer capital to the people that are looking to improve the processes than merely, capture that Tesla is not burning gas.
So